Welcome back to Take It or Leave It commentaries. Today we're going to do something a little different and actually look at a TV episode of the 1970s and 1980s and even into the 1990s series Dallas. I have always loved Dallas. I was very young when Dallas first premiered, but I remember watching it at my parents' and my grandparents', and it was really the definition back then of appointment television. A great cast, great writing. Certainly in the first 7 or 8 seasons, like most TV series, toward the end, it definitely had a decline in quality. But when Dallas was good, it was great. And I've decided to do something a little bit unorthodox, I guess, with Dallas commentaries. I'd like to do more of these, but I didn't want to start in the first episode of the series. Instead, I just kind of picked a random episode that I'm familiar with to give people kind of a feeling of how I feel about the show without going into all the background and details. I will get to the first episode at some point, but I wanted to start with just kind of a representative episode, what the series was all about. This is from season 7. It's episode 18 called 12 Mile Limit. This is one of the best seasons of the show, in my opinion. Some really great writing, some great characters, and we're about to get into it. I'm going to watch this on Amazon Prime. If you'd like to follow along with me as I watch the show and give my commentary and thoughts on things, you can start it right now. And of course, like every episode, this originally started with a an intro into what we're going to kind of see on this episode. Amazon does not include those quick little intros. They were actually repeats from the preview from the previous episode. Later on in the series, they started to give recaps at the beginning of each episode from the previous episode, which actually I think makes a little more sense. But those are not included on the Amazon the Amazon episodes. So we go right into the intro, which is one of the iconic television intros of all time, in my opinion. And I understand why they kind of have to do this with television these days, but you never see these kind of really grab you by the seat of your pants television intros like this. But these are very expensive, and it wastes time, I think, in the opinion of people that make TV shows today, where they think the audience is going to just turn the station or turn to another streaming service if they do intros like that these days. So unfortunately, they've become a thing of the past. And this episode, if you're watching along with me, as you just saw, was directed by Patrick Duffy, who plays Bobby, of course. And here we open up in the gym, and this was considered at the time just an incredible luxury for anyone to have workout equipment inside their home like this. It's much more common nowadays. You also see a phone plugged in there. At least it's not a rotary phone, but they do have some nice equipment. Larry Hagman, of course, makes the series. The conversation he and Sue Ellen are having here, by the way, is a follow up from what happened in the previous episode, which is when Clayton and Miss Ellie have reconciled and decided to get married. After all, Miss Ellie had called the wedding off because of her fear that Clayton would think she was not appealing because of her mastectomy, which I guess she never told him about. And Sue Ellen's not trusting that Jr. is okay with the wedding being back on, which of course he is not. But as I was saying, Larry Hagman, of course, made the show. If you're not familiar with Dallas, Originally, the show was conceived as a starring vehicle for Victoria Principal more than anyone else, and the relationship with her and Bobby was the focus of the show, and Jr. was just one of the ensemble. In some of the early episodes, Jr. is really not seen very much, but pretty quickly the writers and producers figured out that JR was the one that made everything happen. Everyone was constantly talking about JR, reacting in JR, and Larry Hagman's performance and what he brought to the role as far as JR's glee in everything he did that was so awful, and his iconic grin and laughter, that's all Larry Hagman. None of that was written into his character, and he just took over the show. It's something that happens from time to time on series, like with Happy Days and Fonzie, and you could even say the Urkel character, and different things like that. But I think most people that are not familiar with the early episodes of Dallas don't realize that it was not intended to revolve around the character of Jr. This, of course, is Cliff leaving. The kind of the driving plot of really this entire, or the entire second half of this season anyway, is Jr. setting up Cliff in an offshore oil scheme. He had discovered that Cliff was using his JR secretary Sly to spy on the company and to steal deals from him. So JR has decided to go after Cliff and bankrupt Barnes Wentworth to pay Cliff back for all of his shenanigans. And this is JR getting more information about the offshore drilling operation. And I never hated the character of JR. I always liked him, and a lot of times I thought he was correct in what he was trying to do. Especially in the early days of the show when Jock was still around, he was mainly doing Jock's dirty work, and it always bothered me that Jock let him take the fall, um, and never really stood up for him, or at least rarely did so. Especially where Miss Ellie was concerned, it was like Jock was scared of Miss Ellie and was happy to let Jr. take all the heat for things that he had either been directly involved in or had at least taught Jr. to do. And I love JR's office here. He had a few offices over the course of the series, but I think this is by far the office that's mainly associated with him. That's Deborah Renard as Sly. She came on as his secretary a couple of seasons ago, and becomes really a trusted ally of Jr. And he doesn't have many of those, or at least he trusts her as much as he trusts anyone. I always assumed that once this scheme was over, JR would probably. This is what I thought when I was a kid. Again, I was already watching these before I was even a teenager. But I always thought JR would probably just end up firing her after he was done with her, during this little scheme. But he didn't. He kept her around. And I wondered if the writers maybe had that in mind, but then she became kind of a more important figure, during the Cliff Barnes setup. So they decided to keep her. And Barbara Bel Geddes here, obviously, as Miss Ellie, was very important to the show. The casting of the original characters was spot on. They were hit and miss later on with some recasting and bringing in some new characters. I think the only mistake with the original cast was probably Lucy, although she does a great job. I'm talking about Charlene Tilton, uh, as a young, kind of precocious, mischievous teen. She was not able to grow into the role and kind of bring more of a youthful side to the storylines. It just wasn't realistic for her to be in more adult situations, which is why they ended up running out of things for her to do. They had some opportunities, in my opinion, to rectify that by bringing in characters like Jamie Ewing later and a few others. But once again, they badly miscast the role of Jamie Ewing, which we'll get into that more if I get to those episodes, which I would hope to later. But beyond that, the original characters were excellently cast. It's funny that they have Donna here actually listening to Miss Ellie instead of running errands for Dave Culver and worshiping her ex-husband Sam Culver. It seems to be that's Donna's main occupation in life is to worship the Culvers. I, I, I think she's annoying in that way, and she's also very judgmental. Miss Ellie can also be judgmental, but Donna especially is so sanctimonious. Just no one can ever live up to Sam and Dave Culver, in her opinion. It's ridiculous. Those buildings, by the way, are still there. I was in Dallas recently, and it's impossible for me to go by the two gold buildings there and not think of Barnes Wentworth being located there. And this is also before Cliff later on became so much of a buffoon you couldn't take him seriously. But this is when he was still a reasonable rival for JR. No matter how many times he had been beaten down, you still took him seriously because he was able to pull off some things and to one up JR on occasion, and it kept him in the game, so to speak. Bobby has a great office too. I love his little stone area over there on the wall. I even like his lamp. All this is very 80s, of course. And there's Priscilla Presley. As I'm recording this, kind of a unfortunate note. They just this day released the results of her daughter's autopsy. Apparently, she had complications resulting from weight loss surgery, which is very unexpected. It's a sad story all along. And I always really liked the character of Jenna. Priscilla Presley is actually the third person to play Jenna, but I much preferred Bobby and Jenna over Pam. In my opinion, Pam is just such a whiny brat, and Bobby, for some reason, just is Pam's lapdog. I'm not sure why he allows Pam to treat him the way that she does, and especially to keep coming back for more. But man, he is a glutton for punishment when it comes to Pam. Which I didn't notice this until right now, but we haven't even seen Pam in this episode yet, which is a little unusual. Yep, this episode, by the way, was written by David Jacobs and David Paulson. They were regular writers on the show and some of the best they had. The Dallas cast has always referred to Leonard Katzman as kind of the guiding force behind the show, and he was there's not a real title for this, but he decided the overall storylines, and then the other writers would come in and write the individual scenes and episodes. But Leonard Katzman was really the main person behind the storylines in these years, and they're for the most part they're excellent. 12 Mile Limit, by the way, which is the name of the episode. They never showed the names of the episodes when these were broadcast, which is actually a little bit strange. I don't know why they couldn't have just shown the name of each episode as it's showing the guest stars and the directed by credits, but it refers to the territorial limit of a nation which extends 12 miles from the coast out into the ocean until you get into international waters. And the significance of that to this episode is what I explained before, which is the whole offshore drilling scheme that they're involved in to set up Cliff. Ever Renard must have loved this storyline. This is probably much more screen time and exposure than she expected when she first got the job as Sly. Cliff, of course, eventually bids and wins Gold Canyon 340. I don't know enough about the oil business, and I'm not sure if they still auction off offshore tracks like this, but I would be really interested to know kind of what those numbers are now for an oil company. I mean, this is huge money they're talking about, even in 1980s money. And today, I can't, if they still do it this way. Again, I'm not sure they do, but if they auction off tracks today for offshore drilling, I would love to know what those figures are. They must be, uh, based on the inflation of other things, they'd be close to $1 billion. I would assume. And here's Ray and Howard Keel. They were a good pair, and I really liked Clayton on the show. Some people think he could not live up to the or couldn't fill the shoes, I guess, of Jim Davis's jock, and that's fair. No one could. There's Pam finally, and Mark, but I think Clayton does a really good job, and he doesn't try to fill the shoes of Jock, and Clayton basically says that himself. I think he's a good character, and I love his rivalry with Jr. I think it's one of the great aspects of the show. John Beck plays Mark Grayson. I actually saw John Beck in a shopping mall in Los Angeles back. I don't think he was on the show anymore, but it wasn't long after the Dream season, which had been his last season on the show. Just saw him walking down the mall. He's a really tall guy. Steve Canale is Ray. From what I've read, he originally auditioned for the role of Bobby, and they obviously ended up as Ray instead. But I've heard Patrick Duffy talk about Steve Canale and how he's probably the most underappreciated actor on the show, because you never doubt that Steve Canale is very much in real life probably a cowboy type, and is very similar to Ray, and it's actually the opposite. Steve Canale, from what I remember, Patrick Duffy saying, grew up as a fairly well-off guy in Santa Monica that liked to drink martinis. So he is not at all a Ray Krebs type of person. I think he maybe got more interested in Ray Krebs type stuff as he played the role for so long, but he was not at all a a cowboy type in the least. And that's true. Watching the show, you'd never doubt that Steve Canale is very much a Ray, uh, or at least very similar to Ray in real life. There's an episode when Jr. and Sue Ellen are first about to go through their first divorce, and Sue Ellen is living at the Southern Cross with Clayton and Dusty, where Clayton and JR have a meeting about the fact that JR has bought up his oil and is trying to shut down the refineries in exchange for them, and he'll give the oil back if Clayton agrees to throw Sue Ellen and John Ross off Southern Cross. and Clayton basically tells him to go to hell. He doesn't say it like that, but that little confrontation, in my opinion, it's not really heated, but there's just such a kind of a feel of a genuine rivalry there between Jr. and Clayton that that's what kept Howard Keel around, because they realized, well, this really works, and they kept having him come back and butt heads with Jr. And that worked for years on the show and kept the Clayton character around. This is Jr. just totally grinding this this Edgar Randolph person into the dirt, destroying his life to get the information that he needs for the offshore bidding. He has blackmailed Edgar Randolph into giving him the information. You don't know what he's blackmailing him with at this point. Don and Ray find that out later, and they keep it a little vague, but it's basically that he apparently tried to I don't know what the legal term exactly would be, but molest a young girl or sexually assault a young girl when he was still a young person himself at some point. And he's holding that over Edgar's head. Edgar Randolph here is played by Martin Brooks. He Martin E. Brooks is his name. He's got a ton of credits. He's certainly not someone that a casual audience member will be familiar with, but he's in all sorts of things in the 70s and 80s and 90s. He, from the $6 Million Man to Knots Landing, the Dallas spinoff, to Cagney and Lacey, and all kinds of other stuff. There's Mark in his vintage car, which does kind of fit his character. But Mark's another one that just fawns over Pam and lets her walk all over him, and just keeps coming back for more. There are one or two instances where Mark briefly stands up to Pam, but it never lasts long. He always ends up crawling back or apologizing when Pam kind of halfway smiles at him. I mentioned being in Dallas recently, and I did do the South Fork tour. And in case there's someone listening to this that is not aware, everything about South Fork that you've heard is true. It is much, much, much smaller than they make it appear on the show, and not just the house being smaller. The house has just a few bedrooms, nowhere near enough room for all these people. Um, and the land that South Fork sits on is much smaller. It is not this sprawling ranch with this huge amount of land between the house and the road. It's the house is not that far back from the road at all. As a matter of fact, it's just the way they shoot it that makes it look that way. It's really interesting to see it in real life, and I'm glad I did it. We've got some really interesting photos from South Fork that I'm going to put on here. You may already be looking at them. I haven't edited this together yet completely, but it's worth doing if you're in the Dallas area, taking a look at it. It's probably about 45 minutes from downtown, if I remember correctly. Victoria Principal here, she's obviously still very pretty, and she's attractive, but she was, and this is strictly my opinion, so much better looking in the early episodes of the show. Later on, she became far too interested in being as thin as possible, which I know that's not unusual for any actress, but she looked much better when she had more weight on her. Later, she obviously had plastic surgery. I don't know why, but but she was much more appealing, I think, early in the show before she got into all that. This is another kind of side character that I love, Harry McSween. I kind of think of Harry McSween as JR's Al Neary. Al Neary was Michael Corleone's kind of main hatchet guy, and obviously Harry doesn't go around killing people, but I've always thought of him as kind of JR's answer to Al Neary, who, by the way, just total side note, was an ex cop. And this is an example, this conversation that we're having, of one of the things that made this show so great. These little tidbits of information they would give you, and you would find out things as JR and the other characters find them out. Here it's starting to look as if Clayton may have burned down the original house on the Southern Cross Ranch to collect the insurance money, both from the house itself and whatever life insurance his wife had, who apparently was wealthy, and her estate. And it as we get more and more information, it seems like that may well have been what happened. Of course, we find out later it's not what happened, but but we don't learn that until Jr. and the other characters learn it. Everything is working up to a payoff, and that's Fern Fitzgerald as Mary Lee Stone. She was a common kind of side character like Harry McSween that popped up on the show. I'm not sure if she's in the actual in the final season of Dallas or not, but for many years she was a regular character that would pop up. And I mentioned South Fork. They would film the episodes in the summer at South Fork and some other locations around Dallas and around Texas. But only the early episodes of each season actually take place there. Later, they would move everything to Los Angeles, and the outdoor South Fork set, like they would be using in this episode, is not at the actual South Fork. It's actually a sound stage. Sometimes it was more obvious it was a sound stage than at other times, but they did film at the real South Fork over the summer. So the early episodes of each season are at the real ranch, and I've seen pictures and heard stories about how brutal it was to be filming outside at the ranch in summertime. It is brutally hot and brutally humid, and oftentimes you obviously the characters are out there in suits and hats and just in big leather boots and just dying of the heat. It was not always a fun experience. And here I think this is fun. I think Catherine was a good character too. She you really bought that she was just on the edge of being totally maniacal. And I guess later on she turned just completely insane. Seeing here's Pam whining about Bobby, and who look at the way Catherine is dressed here with that thing down around her. Is that really how you talk, or really how you dress, sitting around having a conversation with your half sister? I think that's a little unusual. I mean, I get that the show wants to take advantage of some sex appeal here, but my lord. And of course, these hairstyles are really interesting. Everything is very 80s. See, Pam, she's here talking about how great it was to be eat lunch with Bobby and all that. You could have had that if you weren't so incredibly needy and sanctimonious and wanting to drag Bobby through the mud at every turn. Yeah, Catherine can just barely contain herself here. She's so sick of Pam trying to creep back into Bobby's life. I mean, Catherine's got her hands full right now with trying to get rid of Jenna. She doesn't need Pam whining herself back into the picture. And here we go with what I was just talking about. Just that quick little shot of South Fork, I think, was the sound stage. Ah, Miss Ellie just came in and turned on the light on Bobby, and he didn't jump out of his chair like a normal person would. So far, Bobby has not been in this episode much, which is unusual. But I think that's probably because Patrick Duffy is directing the episode. And look at this very '80s kitchen. The wood they have for the furnishings and the wallpaper. And who keeps their milk in a pitcher? But anyway, yeah, I agree with that. Uh, Bobby just said outside of Daddy, Clayton was the finest man you could have found. I agree with that. Clayton would have been so much better off though if he just stayed at the Southern Cross. I always thought there's an episode a couple of seasons previous to this where Clayton comes to Afton and he's this is when Clayton is in love with Sue Ellen and he's trying to check up on Cliff to make sure Cliff is not using Sue Ellen or basically he's checking on his intentions and he goes to Afton to ask kind of what's going on. And I always thought Afton was really sharp, and always seemed to have things figured out before other people did, and she's the one that spots that Clayton is actually in love with Sue Ellen himself, and all this. I always thought, who would have made a good couple would be Clayton and Afton. If they could have just gone off together and just lived at the Southern Cross and stayed out of all this Ewing and Barnes mess, they could have been really happy together. And I think, and if I remember correctly, Afton even tells, I guess, Sue Ellen at one point that if I had to choose between JR and Cliff, I'd take Clayton every time. I'd so much happier. Ray at the just sitting in the living room cleaning a shotgun. It's such a Ray thing to do. I thought for sure that was probably going to be Dave Culver on the phone. That's usually who calls. Edgar had of course, had a previous relationship with not a I don't mean relationship in that way, but a friendship with Sam Culver, of course. And it's funny when Edgar first shows up on the show, he's constantly introduced as this is Edgar Randolph from Washington, Edgar from Washington. He's from Washington. It's like he's from Bangladesh or something, like someplace exotic. I don't know why they continually have to make it so obvious he's from Washington, but I guess it's just a way to remind the audience who he is. But it's interesting. Let me just put my shotgun together and I'll go. And JR, even around the house, just always, or not always, but certainly usually dressed in his suit, coat buttoned, shirt buttoned all the way up, tie straight and tight, so comfortable. And that '80s room, wow, even those picture frames are '80s, and the pictures themselves and the wallpaper. This is this is when Sue Ellen's character has basically just turned into a bitter hag, in my opinion. and Jr. is trying with Sue Ellen here, but in this particular scene, he's fishing for information to see what she might know about Clayton and his first wife from when she was living at the Southern Cross. I'm definitely in the minority here, but I've always felt that Sue Ellen's character had kind of run its course a couple of seasons before this. I think she should have died in the South Fork fire. Actually, I think that would have kind of brought her character to a very tragic end, where her and Jr. had remarried. She was deliriously happy for a little while, then found out that JR was still JR, and at least as an indirect result of that, because she had been in the accident and when she had been drinking and then had to be sedated, that she had then and died in the fire. It would have been a really interesting part of the show to see JR deal with that kind of guilt, and also to see him as a single father. Not that I think they should have changed his character in any way, but I do think that would have been an opportunity to see at least some expansion of the character, see some sides to the character that we didn't see very often. Because Jr., I think in his own way, certainly did love Sue Ellen, at least at that point, and to have her die again, at least as an indirect result of something he had done, um, would have been a really interesting thing to explore. Plus, it at least would have had someone die in the cliffhanger. In my opinion, there's no point in setting up a cliffhanger like that of who's going to live and who's going to die if no one dies. It was Jr., John Ross, Sue Ellen, and Ray were the ones trapped in the house, and they all made it out uh, fairly easily. I thought that's a little bit of a cheat. And again, I know I'm the minority on that. A lot of people would have would have not enjoyed maybe the show as much, or they think they wouldn't have enjoyed it as much anyway without Sue Ellen on the show. But they just run out of things for her to do. I mean, this is the season where Sue Ellen is involved with Peter Richards, the counselor who was played by Christopher Atkins, and in the next season she starts to drink again, and then they have her and Jr. get together, break up again, back together, break up again. She's drunk, she's not drunk, she's sober, she's not sober. I mean, and then they turned her into a big time businesswoman, which I never bought, and I didn't think made any sense at all. But here we found Edgar Randolph on the floor, and Martin Brooks, who I mentioned that plays Edgar, does a good job with these scenes. You definitely believe that he is a man that is struggling and is on the edge of completely coming apart, which I guess trying to kill yourself means you really have come apart. But I think the actor really does do a good job. And by the way, we have not seen Lucy in this episode at all, which kind of goes back to my comments about Charlene Tilton, and why I thought that was probably the only poor casting choice of the original character. She was not able to grow into the role, and not able to make the character interesting past her teenage years. I think a good example from another show of a slightly similar character anyway was Nicolette Sheridan as Paige on Knots Landing. That was an excellent piece of casting, and the fact that she could pull off being a teenager, but it was also believable as she matured later on into a business role, and to one of the most central characters on that series is a good example of something that is done correctly. And I think that might have been what they had in mind this next season, because which would be Charlene Tilton's last. They bring in the character of Jamie Ewing as a Ewing cousin, which could have kind of filled that role if after Charlene Tilton was let go from the series. But they badly miscast it again, and I'm not sure why they chose Jenny Lee Harrison of all people from Three's Company to for that part. I, I think they had to find someone that was attractive, but yet you could also believe would get involved with Cliff Barnes. And because of that, you couldn't have someone that was too attractive and too striking, because I think they thought we just wouldn't buy that. So they tried to kind of have it both ways. Have her attractive and appealing, but not too attractive and appealing, and that limited the character, just simply because they wanted that small little plot line of her marrying Cliff at just before the Ewing oil trial, which we can get into that a little later. But it's too bad they couldn't get that stuff right on this show, because that's one thing that hurt it in the later years, was that there was no real youthful contingent of characters on the show. They tried to do it again later with JR's illegitimate son showing up, which I think was a good idea, but should have happened not maybe this season that we're watching, but I think the season after this, they should have gone ahead and introduced that kind of character. I would have done it in a different way, and I certainly would not have cast who they cast. That was another very poor casting job. The Michelle character, I think, was a much better piece of casting. I think she was interesting, and they also brought in April, who I thought they kept her character around a little longer than she needed to be around. But April, certainly when her first couple of seasons on the show, was a very successful casting and a very successful character. And if you kind of look back at it, in retrospect, what if they had cast Sherry J. Wilson as Jamie Ewing instead? Then that could have been a Ewing character that was younger and was able to evolve into a central figure on the show. But they kind of fumbled that. I love Sly raking Cliff over the coals here. As I mentioned before, I never hated the character of JR. I mean, I kind of understood where he was coming from in a lot of things. Certainly, he crossed the line of what was reasonable behavior a lot of times. But I did hate Cliff. I mean, he was the character I loved to hate. I always wanted JR to just squash him. Here comes Ray and Donna. And of course, JR is at the office. 99% of the time, luckily for the show, that whenever someone barged into someone's office or went to someone's house looking for them, they were 99% of the time they were there. Give me a break, Donna. Again, Donna's so sanctimonious. She's forgotten that her beloved Sam Culver, led a family member to suicide himself. But she's in here raising hell with JR. What I'm referring to is Sam and Jock had this guy Jonas committed to a sanitarium so they could get his land from him that had a bunch of oil on it, and Jonas committed suicide. But Donna has conveniently forgotten that tidbit of information when she's here in JR's face. This is a really good piece of writing. This conversation here of why of how Jr. goes about not convincing them because they don't completely buy this, but but at least making it realistic that he didn't blackmail Randolph because of him and Bobby deciding not to go in on the offshore oil tracks. Hagman wore a toupee, by the way. If you're a fan of Dallas, you're probably aware of this. For a lot of the series, and it sometimes, especially at the beginning of a season, it would look really good, and be practically undetectable. But as the seasons wore on, it would start looking worse and worse. And I don't know, luckily enough, about toupees to understand why that is. I mean, I guess as your own hair grows, it gets harder and harder to kind of blend it in. And here, it's not looking that great. It basically looks, like a fake thing of hair on top of his head, which it was. And Hagman didn't wear a full toupee when he wore something. He wore, I don't know what they're referred to as, but he just wore a bit of a smaller piece that was just meant to kind of fill in his hairline mostly. And again, sometimes it looked great, but oftentimes as the season wore on, it was more and more obvious. And of course, a lot of these cast members now have passed away. Unfortunately, Larry Hagman, of course, Miss Ellie, Barbara Bel Geddes, Howard Keel, Martin Brooks, who's in this episode as Edgar Randolph, has passed away, but Morgan Brittany is still around, and Victoria Principal, Patrick Duffy, Charlene Tilton, Steve Canale, Susan Howard. I can't remember the name. This is Catherine looking for Naldo Marquetta in order to drive a wedge between Bobby and Jenna. The actor that plays Naldo Marquetta, and you never know how much of this is true or not, but was supposedly at one point, I'm not sure if he ever auditioned or not, but was considered for the role of James Bond. But he's passed away as well. This is a fantastic scene. This is one of the reasons I wanted to do this episode, and we'll wrap it up here as this episode concludes. And this is so Jr. to bring in not only to go see Edgar in the hospital, but to bring flowers. Um, and if you'll notice, it could have been very easy for Hagman at the end of this episode to do Jr.'s kind of trademark grin and laugh, but he doesn't. He simply just has this sinister, hard stare at Edgar, which is a great choice on behalf of Hagman. He would use that when even Jr. as much joy as he seemed to take in his own schemes, there were times when he did not do the grin and the laugh, and that meant this is serious business, and I am not fooling around here. And that's what he chose for this moment. I think it's perfect. I mean, Jr. going to visit someone who he's basically driven to a suicide attempt, leaning into it with the visit and the flowers and giving him that stare to make sure he understands I am not playing. Here it comes. And the music too. That's one thing I haven't mentioned of how key the music is to this series' success. I just love that right there. But anyway, this went by awfully quick. It seems like. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed watching it and talking about the episode. If there's anything specific you'd like me um, to do a video on, or another specific episode of Dallas, or another TV show, or whatever, please feel free to comment. And if you'd like to make sure you catch my other videos as soon as they're up, please subscribe. Like I said, I think what I'll do for this is add some pictures of my visit to Dallas and South Fork specifically here, just to give you guys something to look at. Obviously, can't just show you the episode as I talk about it because I'll get hit with a copyright issue and there won't be any video to watch. So maybe some things like that. And I hope you've enjoyed the commentary, and I will see you again later. Thanks a lot.